The night Tobias Chandler found her, the temperature had dropped so fast that the mud beneath his boots had gone hard as iron, and the stars burned cold and merciless above the Thornridge homestead. And even before he raised his lantern, he could see by the blue-white moonlight that whatever had stumbled into his barn doorway was neither horse nor wolf, but something far more desperate. He had been awake because the goats were screaming. Tobias was 26 years old, lean and broad-shouldered from 4 years of working this land alone after his father died of a chest fever, and he had learned in that time to trust the goats the way other men trusted watchdogs. When they screamed with that particular pitch, not the ordinary complaint of hunger or cold, but the high, spiraling shriek of a creature that has registered something alien in its territory. He pulled on his boots, lit the tin lantern from the embers in the hearth, and went out into the dark without hesitating. He nearly walked into her. She was enormous. That was the first word his mind produced, the only word that fit, because she stood in the open barn doorway and filled it from jamb to jamb, her head clearing the top beam by barely 2 inches. She was an orc woman, and she was built the way the northern mountains were built, massive, powerful, sculptured by forces that did not apologize for themselves, with broad shoulders tapering to a defined waist, and long, muscled arms that could have snapped the door frame if she had pressed against it. She had green-gray skin the color of deep river water in shadow, and 2 small tusks that curved upward from her lower jaw, polished and pale against the dark of her face. Her black hair was heavy and tangled from hard travel, falling loose around her shoulders. She was wearing a fitted leather bodice that laced up the front with rawhide cord, dark brown and worn smooth with use, cinched tight enough at the waist that Tobias could see the shape of her clearly even in the lantern light. Below it she wore a knee-length travel skirt of oiled canvas, slit high on one side for movement, over leggings the color of charcoal. A single strap crossed her chest and connected to a satchel bag at her hip. Everything about her clothes said she had traveled far and traveled hard. She was also holding something against her chest that was so small against her vast frame that Tobias's mind refused to process it for a full 2 seconds. A cradle. Not a baby in a cradle, the cradle itself, a tiny one barely the length of his forearm, carved from pale birch wood, and inside it, wrapped in a length of orc-woven cloth, something was moving, something very small, something making a thin, trembling sound that cut straight through the cold air and lodged directly in the center of his chest. A baby, a newborn or close enough to it, wrapped and swaddled, alive but clearly frightened by the cold. The orc woman looked at him. Her eyes were amber, the deep, warm amber of pine resin, and they were full of a ferocious, cornered kind of pride that was fighting a losing battle against exhaustion. There were old bloodstains on her leather bodice, dried to brown, and a deep cut along her left forearm that had been bound with a strip of cloth but was seeping through. Her bare feet, she had lost her boots somewhere, or had no boots to begin with, were bleeding from the frozen ground. "I need nothing from you," she said. Her voice was deep and low and roughened by hours of cold and pain, and she said it the way a person says something they do not entirely believe. "Only the barn, one night." Tobias Chandler stood in the dark with his lantern and looked at her bleeding feet and the tiny cradle held against her chest and the infant making that terrible thin sound, and he made the only decision he had ever been capable of making when it came to things that were suffering. "You need more than the barn," he said. "Come inside." Her amber eyes narrowed. "You are not afraid." "Oh, I am afraid," he said honestly, "but you are bleeding on my ground and that baby is going to freeze, so we can talk about fear later. Come inside." She did not move for a long moment. Tobias could see the war playing out behind those amber eyes, the pride, the distrust, the years of knowing what human men did when they had power over orcs, and he stood very still and did not rush her. He simply held the lantern a little steadier so she could see his face clearly, so she could read whatever was there. Whatever she read, it was enough. She stepped through his door. His cabin was not large. It was one room with a stone hearth, a plank table, 2 chairs, a narrow rope bed, and shelves cluttered with trapping supplies, dried herbs, and the accumulated practical debris of a man living alone on the frontier. It was warm, though. He had kept the fire built up, and the warmth hit them both like a wall when they came in. She was so large that the cabin felt immediately different with her in it. Not threatening, just full, in a way it had not been full in years. "Sit," Tobias said, gesturing to the hearthside. He pulled the larger of his two chairs closer to the fire, and then, after a second's thought, pushed it aside entirely and pulled the rug instead, because the chair would barely accommodate her. He brought blankets from the bed and laid them near the heat. She lowered herself to the floor with a controlled, careful motion, and even sitting she was nearly as tall as he was standing. She adjusted the tiny cradle in her grip, and her expression, so fiercely guarded until now, shifted into something softer and more complicated as she looked down at it. One of her enormous hands, her fingers were nearly twice the width of his, reached into the cradle, and she extended a single careful finger and rocked it, just barely, just gently, with a precision that was almost painful to watch given the contrast between the size of her hand and the smallness of the thing she was touching. The baby quieted almost immediately. Tobias did not say anything for a moment. He put water on to boil and found his tin of dried yarrow and a roll of clean linen and brought them to her without asking for permission or explanation. "The arm," he said simply. She looked at him again with that searching, amber gaze. Then she extended her arm. He worked carefully, unwinding the sodden cloth, cleaning the wound with the boiled yarrow water. It was a blade cut, not a claw or a fall. Someone had done this to her deliberately, and it was deep enough that he used 4 small stitches from his sewing kit, each one made with the same steady hand he used to mend harness leather. She did not flinch. She sat utterly still and kept her other hand resting inside the cradle, her one careful finger moving in that slow, rhythmic rock. "The baby," Tobias said when he had wrapped her arm in clean linen. "Yours." Something moved across her face. "My sister's," she said. "My sister is dead." The weight of those 4 words sat in the room like a stone dropped in water. He did not push. He tied off the linen bandage and sat back on his heels. "What is your name?" he asked. She considered him for a moment. The firelight made her skin glow with warmer undertones, and her amber eyes were steady. "Ugak," she said. "Ugak Bloodhorn. Tobias Chandler," he said. He held out his hand the way he would have held it out to any neighbor. She looked at his hand for a beat longer than was comfortable. Then she put her enormous, calloused hand into his, and they shook, and neither of them let go for a second longer than strictly necessary. "The baby has a name?" he asked. "Dura," she said. The word had a softness to it that her voice had not carried before, a tenderness that she perhaps did not intend to expose. "She is 4 days old." Tobias nodded slowly. He was doing the arithmetic in his head. 4 days. Midwinter. An orc woman traveling alone with a newborn across frozen ground with no boots and a blade wound. A tiny birch cradle held against her chest with that infinite care. Whatever had happened, it had been bad, and it had been recent, and she had survived it through sheer force of will and love for a child that was not even hers. He made soup from what he had dried venison and preserved turnips and a handful of dried greens, and said nothing else that was not necessary. When it was done, he put a deep bowl in front of her and filled it generously, and then filled a smaller bowl for himself and sat on his side of the hearth and ate. She watched him with wary precision for the first 3 bites. When it became clear that he was simply eating, she ate too, and she ate with the focused intensity of someone who has not eaten in longer than they will admit. The baby, Dura, slept. Tobias gave them his bed without discussion. There was no scenario in which he was going to put this woman back on the floor with a 4-day-old infant when he had a bed available, and he settled himself in the larger chair by the fire with a blanket and his own stubborn capacity for discomfort. He had slept in worse places. Through the night he woke twice to the sound of Ugak moving. Both times it was the same, the small, careful sounds of her tending to the baby, feeding her, resettling her in the cradle, And both times, in the orange-dark quiet of the banked fire, Tobias lay still and listened to the deep, low hum of what he realized after a moment was a song, an orc cradle song, something so old and quiet it felt like it had been grown from the ground rather than made by any throat. He lay with his eyes half open and listened to it, and felt something move in his chest that had been still for a very long time. In the morning she was sitting by the dead fire with the cradle on her knees, and she looked up at him with her amber eyes and said, "Why did you let me in?" "Because you needed it," he said. "Many men would not." "Many men are fools," he said, and went to build up the fire. She watched him. He could feel it, that careful, measuring orc gaze tracking every movement he made, reading him the way you'd read trail signs. He did not perform for it. He simply built the fire and put coffee on real coffee, one of the few extravagances he allowed himself from the trading post at Kelford, and found what he had for breakfast. "I will leave today," she said. "When the child is fed and settled." "Where will you go?" Silence. "You do not have boots," he said. More silence. "It is 3 days hard walking to Kelford in summer." In this cold, with no boots and a 4-day-old baby, that distance becomes something else entirely. He poured coffee into a heavy mug and set it near her. "There is no rush, Ugak. You can stay until the baby is stronger and your feet are healed." She looked at the coffee. She looked at him. "You do not know anything about me." "I know you walked barefoot over frozen ground to save your sister's child," he said. "That is more than most people tell me about themselves." She was quiet for a long time after that. She picked up the coffee and drank it, and when she did, her eyes closed briefly in the involuntary pleasure of someone who has not had warmth in days. He looked away so she could have that moment privately. She did not leave that day. She did not leave the next day either, because the temperature dropped another 15 degrees, and even Tobias did not go farther from the cabin than the barn, and because little Dura developed a worrying, rattling cough that made Ugak's jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with terror. Tobias knew what to do with a chest cough in a newborn. His mother had been the nearest thing to a healer in 3 valleys, and she had taught him before she died. And he made a steam tent from blankets over the cradle and a pot of boiling water with dried pine resin, and he sat up with Ugak through 2 nights straight, while the baby coughed and breathed and fought her way through it. On the second night, with the fire built high and the steam rising and the baby sleeping shallowly in the cradle between them, Ugak said, without looking at him, "My sister's name was Vara." He waited. "She was taken by men from Kelford 3 months ago. They sold her to a clan lord east of the mountains." Her voice was completely level. It was the kind of level that costs a great deal to maintain. "She was carrying, I went to get her back." A pause. "I was too late to get her back alive, but I was in time for the child." "The blade cut," Tobias said. "One of the clan lord's men. I killed him afterward." He said nothing for a moment. "Good," he said. She did finally look at him then, those amber eyes startled as if she had expected something different from him. "You do not disapprove?" "He cut you while you were trying to save a baby," Tobias said. "No, I do not disapprove." The firelight moved over her face. She was beautiful, he thought, in the way that things built for hard use and genuine purpose were beautiful. The structure of her face, the set of her jaw, the deep, steady amber of her eyes. He did not let himself look for longer than was appropriate. He looked back at the baby. "What will you do with her?" he asked. "Dura." "Raise her," Ugak said, as if this were the most obvious answer in the world. "She is Vara's, she is mine." The simplicity of it hit him somewhere below the ribs. He nodded. "Then you will need a safe place to do it," he said. "The clans east of the mountains, they may come looking." "They will come looking," Ugak confirmed. "The man I killed was the Lord's cousin." Tobias absorbed this. "How long do you think we have?" She looked at him. "We." He met her gaze directly. "You are on my land, that makes it my problem too." He watched the war play out in her face again, that old, scarred distrust fighting something newer and less certain. "You do not owe me anything," she said carefully. "No," he agreed. "But I am choosing to help anyway. There is a difference." The baby coughed once softly, and Ugak's hand moved into the cradle without thought, and her enormous finger rocked it in that steady, minute motion, and little Dura settled back to sleep. Tobias watched that gesture, and something in his chest made a decision that his mind would not fully articulate for several months yet. The cold broke in 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, the homestead found a rhythm. Ugak was not the kind of person who accepted charity in stillness. She was up before him every morning, tending the goats with a natural efficiency that had the animals quieting around her within 3 days, splitting firewood with powerful strokes that halved his usual workload, mending the barn roof with a competence that outpaced his. She learned which goats were skittish and which were friendly. She learned where he kept the grain. She learned how he liked his morning coffee strong, no sweetening, and she made it without being asked, setting it near his chair before he was fully awake, and then looked as though she was surprised at herself for having done it. He taught her where his property lines ran. She taught him 4 words of orc language, and when he repeated them back with the wrong inflection and made them mean something entirely different, she laughed, a sudden, surprised sound, low and rich, that filled the cabin and then was quickly suppressed as if she thought she ought not to have done it. He liked it enormously. Dura grew stronger. The cough cleared. She was a sturdy, solemn infant with dark gray-green skin and wide, watchful eyes, and she regarded Tobias with an expression of supreme skepticism that he found entirely charming. He was careful with her, careful in the way you learn to be careful with something precious and fragile, and Ugak noticed this and said nothing, but her amber eyes were tracking it. One evening he came in from the field to find Ugak sitting in the last of the light by the window, Dura asleep in the cradle on the table, and Ugak had taken a piece of cedar bark and a small knife and was carving something. Her enormous hands moved with astonishing delicacy, the knife blade guided by the tips of her fingers in tiny, controlled strokes. When she heard him, she did not put it away. "What are you making?" he asked. "A protection charm," she said. "For Dura. My grandmother showed me. Every child of our clan receives one." He put down his tools and came to look. It was not finished, but he could see the shape of it, a small, flat medallion of bark with a spiral pattern carved into its face, intricate as lace. "It is beautiful," he said honestly. Ugak said nothing, but her shoulders settled slightly as though she had been expecting criticism and had to realign herself around the absence of it. He pulled up the other chair and sat beside her, close enough to watch her work, and she did not move away. They sat like that while the light died and he lit the lantern and she kept carving and he sorted harness fittings that needed mending, and the baby slept and the fire burned down and the cabin was quiet and warm, and Tobias thought, "This is the least alone I have felt in 4 years." He did not say it. But he thought it, and he let himself think it, which was already more than he had allowed himself in a long time. The thaw came properly in early spring, and with it came the first trouble from Kelford. It arrived in the shape of 3 men on horseback who came up the wagon trail to his land on a Wednesday morning, when Ugak was in the barn, and Tobias was staking the south fence line. He saw them coming from 100 yards and knew trouble by the set of their shoulders before they were close enough to recognize. He left his fence post in the ground and walked to meet them in the yard, putting himself between them and the barn door, which was his intention. The man in front was Owen Barath, who ran a trading concern out of Kelford, and had the particular kind of meaty self-confidence that came from never having been seriously wrong-footed by life. He was flanked by 2 men Tobias knew by face but not by name. "Chandler," Barath said, not bothering to dismount. "Heard you've been sheltering an orc female. Big one came through 3 weeks back." "Where did you hear that?" Tobias said. "Doesn't matter, is it true?" "I don't recall that being your business," Tobias said. Barath's jaw tightened. "Clan Lord Gorik Ashfist has men looking for a female orc who killed one of his household. Goes by Bloodhorn. We are authorized to—" "By whom?" Tobias said. "You are authorized by whom to do anything on my property?" "Chandler, do not make this difficult. The orc killed a man. There are consequences." "The man she killed had just murdered her sister," Tobias said. His voice was very quiet and very steady. "And I would think carefully about what you do next, Barath, because you are on my land and I am standing here and there are 3 of you and I am 1 man, and I want you to think about what that tells you about how this ends if you push it." He was not touching his rifle. It was on his back, slung easy, and his hands were loose at his sides, but he held Barath's gaze with the specific calm of a man who has decided exactly what he will and will not allow. From behind him he heard the barn door open. He did not look back. He kept his eyes on Barath. Ugak stepped out into the morning light. She was enormous in the full daylight, even more so than in the dark of his cabin, and she stood behind Tobias with little Dura held against her chest in a cloth wrap, one enormous hand pressed flat against the baby's back. She was not armed. She did not need to look armed. She simply stood and looked at the 3 men on horseback with those amber eyes that held nothing apologetic in them whatsoever. Barath's horse shied. Both flanking riders pulled their reins tight. "That child," Barath said. "Is that the child of—" "That child is mine," Ugak said, her voice carrying across the yard like a drum struck once. "She is under my protection." She is under his protection. She placed one enormous hand briefly on Tobias's shoulder, a gesture that was both territorial and deliberate. "You will go now." Tobias felt the weight of that hand through his coat. He kept his eyes on Barath. Barath looked at Ugak, looked at Tobias, looked at the rifle on Tobias's back and the specific expression on Tobias's face, which was not angry, not aggressive, but was absolutely final. "This isn't over, Chandler," Barath said. "I know," Tobias said. "Come back when you have something more than a clan lord's instructions, and we'll continue the conversation." Barath turned his horse. The 2 flanking men followed. Tobias watched them until they had rounded the bend in the trail and disappeared into the tree line. Ugak's hand lifted from his shoulder. He turned around. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something stripped of its usual careful composure, something that was closer to raw than she generally allowed. "They will come back," she said. "Yes," he said, "so we will be ready." "Tobias." She said his name fully, deliberately, as if she were placing it somewhere important. "You do not have to do this. I can take Dura and walk where," he said. "To the next homestead, to Kelford where Barath operates, Ugak." He said her name back to her with the same weight she had given his. "You are not walking anywhere you do not want to walk. This is your home as long as you want it." The silence that followed was very full. "I do not understand you," she said finally. "That is fair," he said. "I do not entirely understand myself, but I know what is right and this is it." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly required. "Come inside. The baby needs feeding and I need coffee and we have a fence to finish after." She blinked. Something at the corner of her mouth moved. "You always solve things with coffee," she said. "Coffee and work," he said. "Between the 2 of them, most problems become smaller." She followed him inside, and he heard, very quietly behind him, that low, rich laugh again, and this time she did not suppress it quite so quickly. The weeks that followed were a kind of happiness that Tobias had not known how to name when it was happening, only in retrospect. They worked the land together, and she worked with the focused authority of someone who had done hard physical labor her whole life, harder than his, from what she let drop in small pieces of conversation. She had grown up in a clan camp, the kind that moved with the seasons, and she had hunted and carried and built and fought since she was old enough to be useful. She did not talk about it often, but she talked about it more than she had talked about anything in the first weeks, and each small piece she gave him he received carefully, like something that had been carried a long distance and deserved to be set down gently. He told her about his father, about learning to trap in these mountains at age 12 with cold fingers and bad technique, about the way the land had become his by default rather than design, and how he had not known at first whether he would keep it or sell it and go somewhere easier. He told her about the year after his father died, which had been the hardest year of his life, alone in the cabin through the winter with nothing but the goats and his own thoughts, and a stack of books he read until they fell apart. Books, she said, looking at his small shelf with new attention. You can read many things. Everything on that shelf, he said. And more that I lent to neighbors who did not return them. I cannot read, she said. There was no shame in it, it was simply a fact. It was not something clans taught, we had other ways of keeping knowledge. Would you like to learn, he asked. She looked at him steadily. You would teach me, if you wanted. She thought about it for 3 days. Then one evening she brought him the book he'd been reading, a thick-spined account of frontier surveying methods, not particularly entertaining but functional, and set it on the table between them and sat down. Teach me, she said. He taught her. It went slowly at first, and then with sudden accelerating speed, because Ugak's mind was extraordinarily precise and patient and capable of holding enormous amounts of information with perfect clarity. Within 2 weeks she was sounding out words on her own. Within 6 weeks she was reading his surveying book in the evenings, her brow furrowed, her enormous finger tracing each line, occasionally asking him about words she did not know. He would move his chair beside hers to point them out. Their shoulders would nearly touch. He would become very aware of the warmth of her beside him, the deep, clean scent of her wood smoke and pine, and something that was simply and specifically Ugak. And he would find himself reading the same paragraph 3 times in his own head while she read her page. He was falling in love with her. He knew it in the precise, clear-sighted way that a man who lives alone and has thought a great deal about himself knows his own interior landscape. He was falling in love with the way she moved, with that controlled, powerful grace that was entirely unconscious. He was falling in love with the sound of her laugh, which she gave rarely and only when genuinely surprised by something. He was falling in love with the way she held Dura, that vast, careful tenderness, a woman who could splinter a fence post with one strike of an axe, who had somehow taught every part of herself to be infinitely gentle with the smallest creature in the room. He did not say any of it. Not yet. There was too much between them still. The distance she maintained, the way she sometimes went very still and watchful when he moved near her, the long-trained caution of someone who had learned not to trust quickly. He would not hurry it. He would simply be what he was, which was here and patient, and hers when she was ready for that to mean something. The danger they had been waiting for arrived in midsummer. It came with more warning this time. A rider from the Feddick homestead 3 miles north, a boy of about 15 named Cal, who arrived out of breath on a sweating horse and said that there were 6 men, 2 of them orc warriors employed by Clan Ashfist, camped at the crossroads and asking questions about a female orc and a stolen child. Tobias thanked him and pressed a coin into his hand and sent him back by the longer, safer route through the forest. He told Ugak. She was at the table feeding Dura, who was now 3 months old and opinionated about mealtime. She did not react immediately. He finished settling the baby, placed her carefully in the cradle, and then looked up at Tobias with those amber eyes, very clear and very quiet. How many? She said. 6, 2 of them clan warriors. She was quiet. I will not let them have Dura. No, he agreed, they will not have her. Tobias, her voice was very careful. I will not let you die for us. Then we will ensure that no one dies, he said. I have a plan, but it requires you to trust me. She met his eyes for a long moment. I trust you, she said, and the simplicity of it moved through him like warm water. They rode for Kelford the next morning, the 3 of them, Tobias on horseback and Ugak on the large draft mare he'd borrowed against everything he owned, Dura in the cloth wrap at Ugak's chest. It was a calculated gamble. Going to Kelford before the Ashfist men found them at the homestead meant controlling the ground, and in Kelford there was a magistrate named Reese, who Tobias's father had known, an old and somewhat creaking instrument of justice, but a genuine one. And there was also the matter of a law that Tobias had spent 3 evenings this past week reading about in his surveying book's legal appendix, and then in a battered copy of the border settlement laws that he'd retrieved from under a loose floorboard where his father had stored things of value. The law was this: A child born within the recognized frontier territories to a parent who was kin to that child's guardian could be registered under frontier protection codes, which meant no clan lord east of the mountains could claim jurisdiction without contest from a territorial court. Dura was kin to Ugak. Ugak had established residence on settled frontier land. This was the argument. Whether it would hold was another question. They arrived in Kelford at mid-morning, and the arrival was exactly the kind of cinematic, crowd-stopping moment that Tobias had hoped not to need, but had planned for anyway. The town's main street was busy market day, carts and horses in the controlled chaos of commerce, and the sight of Ugak Bloodhorn riding in on a draft horse, nearly 7 feet of green-gray orc woman with a baby at her chest and amber eyes burning like 2 banked coals, brought the street to a standstill in the way a summer thunderstorm brings a picnic to a standstill. People stopped. People stared. One woman pulled her child behind her. A man near the livery put his hand on his belt knife. Tobias rode beside Ugak and did not look at the crowd. He looked only forward, and his expression said, "This is ordinary and she is with me, and if you have a problem with that you are welcome to discuss it with my rifle." Behind them, Ugak held herself very still on the horse, her chin up, her eyes forward, carrying herself with the dignity of someone who has been stared at their entire life and has developed an opinion about it. They tied the horses in front of the magistrate's building, which was a low stone structure with a heavy door and an air of reluctant authority. Owen Barath was on the street. Of course he was. He saw them at the same moment they saw him, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on something ugly. "Chandler," he said, coming toward them with 3 men at his back. "You have a lot of nerve bringing that Owen." Tobias stepped off his horse and stood between Barath and Ugak with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "We are going to see the magistrate. You are welcome to come and make your case, or you are welcome to step aside. Those are the choices." "She is wanted by Clan Ashfist. She is a frontier resident," Tobias said, "and the child she is carrying is registered under her protection, and we are going to put that in writing this morning. Now you can either have a conversation about law, or you can have a different kind of conversation, but I want to be very clear about which one I prefer." He did not move his hands toward his rifle. He did not need to. He simply stood there, loose and clear-eyed, and waited. The crowd had gathered now, a ring of townspeople watching, the way people always watched when something real was happening in a frontier town. Tobias could feel their collective attention like a physical weight. From behind him, Ugak stepped down from the horse. She was standing, a full head and then some taller than any man on the street, and she stood beside Tobias with Dura against her chest, and looked out at the crowd with those amber eyes that held no fear in them, only the kind of patient endurance that has been built from being stared at in too many street markets in too many towns for too many years. "She killed a man," someone in the crowd said. "She rescued a child from the man who killed her sister," Tobias said, loud enough for everyone. "If any of you would not have done the same, I would like to have a conversation about your values." Nobody answered. The crowd shuffled and murmured, but nobody answered. Barath's jaw worked. He looked at Ugak, he looked at the baby, he looked at Tobias's expression, and whatever arithmetic he was doing in his head produced a number he did not like. "This is not over," Barath said for the second time. "I believe you said that before," Tobias said. "Come inside and let us see if we can make it be over." He held the magistrate's door open. After a beat, Ugak walked through it. Tobias followed. The magistrate's name was Reese, and he was, as Tobias had gambled, an instrument of genuine if weary justice. He was 60 years old and had seen several centuries' worth of frontier disputes in his tenure, and he listened to Tobias's argument, the border settlement laws, the protection codes, Dura's kinship to Ugak, Ugak's residency on settled frontier land with the expression of a man who is being handed an interesting problem and is not entirely displeased about it. It took 3 hours. Barath came in and made his case for the Ashfist claim, which mostly consisted of repeating the word jurisdiction at intervals. Ugak sat at the table and answered Reese's questions directly and without embellishment, and when she described what had happened to her sister and what she had done about it, she did so with a clarity that left no ambiguity. Reese wrote for a long time. Then he stamped 2 documents. "The child Dura," he said, "is registered as a frontier resident under the guardianship of Ugak Bloodhorn, resident of the Chandler homestead, Thornridge district. Clan jurisdiction from east of the mountains does not extend to registered frontier dependents. This is law." He looked at Bareth over the top of the documents. "If Clan Ashfist wants to contest this, they will need to file with the territorial court in Redstone, which takes 6 months minimum and costs more than a stolen child is worth to any but the most stubborn of lords. I suggest they choose their stubbornness accordingly." Bareth left without another word. Tobias and Ugak walked out of the magistrate's office into the afternoon sun with a stamped document in Tobias's hand. And Dura was awake now, looking up at the sky with enormous skeptical eyes, and the town of Kelford watched them walk to their horses and did not stop them. On the road back to Thornridge, with the sun behind them and the mountains purple-green in the distance and the horses moving at an easy walk, Ugak reached over without warning and put her enormous hand over his where it rested on the saddle horn. She did not look at him. She looked at the road ahead. He turned his hand over beneath hers and laced his fingers through hers as best he could, given the difference in size, and she allowed it. They rode the rest of the way home like that, without speaking, which was better than speaking. The summer settled into something quieter. The Ashfist men did not come. Bareth gave them a wide berth in Kelford. Word spread the way word always spreads on the frontier, slowly, imperfectly, but persistently, that the orc woman at Chandler's homestead had papers, and that Tobias Chandler was not a man who could be moved, and that engaging either of them was more trouble than whatever principle you thought you were defending. In the long summer evenings, Tobias began to learn more deliberately what Ugak was. Not the broad strokes, those he had gathered in the months, but the specifics, that she could name every plant in the forest and half of them had uses she'd explain in careful detail. That she had a fierce and slightly formal sense of humor that expressed itself in perfectly deadpan observations that took him 3 seconds to understand, and then made him laugh so hard his eyes watered. That she sang, not just to Dura but sometimes to herself when she thought she was alone, old clan songs that moved like rivers through their keys. That she had opinions. Firm, detailed, occasionally heated opinions about everything from the best way to mend a stone wall to the political arrangements between the frontier towns and the eastern clans, and that engaging her on any of these topics produced the most interesting conversations he'd had in years. That when she was tired, she had a habit of reaching up and pressing 2 fingers briefly against her own forehead, as if resetting something, and he found this gesture absolutely devastating for reasons he could not entirely explain. He was no longer pretending, even to himself, that he was simply being neighborly. One evening in August, with Dura sleeping in her cradle and the windows open to the warm night and the sound of summer insects outside, Ugak was reading. She read now with total ease, moving through his small library with a systematic thoroughness that he had come to love, and she stopped and looked up and said, without preamble, "You look at me differently than other people look at me." He was very still. "How do other people look at you?" he asked. "With fear," she said, "or contempt, or the particular kind of false friendliness that is actually another kind of contempt." She turned the book over in her hands. "You look at me as if I am," she paused, choosing carefully, "as if I am here. Fully, as if the whole of me is something you are glad to see." "You are," he said quietly. "The whole of you, yes." The room was very still. Dura breathed in her cradle. Outside, the insects kept on. Ugak looked at him. Her amber eyes were luminous in the low lamplight. She was extraordinary. He was aware of it as a physical fact, the way you are aware of a mountain or a river, something that exists on a different scale than ordinary things. "Tobias," she said, and stopped. "Yes," he said. "I have not," she began again. I have not allowed myself to want things, she said. Not for a long time, it was safer not to. Things that orcs want in human country are generally denied to them, and it is less painful to want nothing. I know, he said. I am, she closed the book, set it aside, straightened to her full height. I find that I am wanting things, she said, specific things, and I do not know what to do with that. He stood up from his chair. He crossed the room, which was not a large distance, and he stood in front of her. She was taller than him by a significant measure, and so he looked up somewhat, which should have been awkward and was instead simply the way it was, and he said, I want specific things too. And I am not going to push for them, and I am not going anywhere, and I will let you decide when and whether and how. But I want you to know that they are there. She looked at him for a very long moment. The lamplight made shadows and warmth across her face in equal measure. Then she reached up slowly with that enormous careful hand, and she put her palm against the side of his face. He was very still. Her hand was warm and rough with calluses and somehow exactly right, and he turned his face very slightly into her palm the way you turn toward warmth without thinking. She leaned down. He reached up. The first kiss was very soft and very careful and very exactly right. The kind of first kiss that has been building for months and arrives with the certainty of something that was always going to happen, that needed only the right moment to become real. Her mouth was warm, and her hands came to frame his face with a gentleness that was entirely characteristic of her, that same infinite care she gave to everything that mattered. When they drew back, they were both very quiet for a moment. I have been wanting to do that for a long time, she said. I have been wanting that for a long time, he agreed. That made her laugh, the full laugh, uninhibited, the low, rich sound filling the cabin, and he laughed too. And Dura stirred in her cradle and made a small, disgruntled noise, and they both looked at her, and then looked at each other, and the warmth in the room had absolutely nothing to do with the temperature. What grew between them from that point was not a sudden thing, but a deepening of something that had already been growing for months. It was in the way they worked together now, with the easy coordination of two people who have learned each other's rhythms, who knew without discussion who would do what. It was in the evenings, when she would sit close enough that their shoulders touched, and he would lean into that contact, and she would let him. It was in the mornings, when he woke to find that she had brought coffee to his side of the table and was already there, reading or tending to Dura, and the cabin felt full in the best possible way. They had long evenings of conversation, now real ones, the kind that moved in every direction and had no agenda and kept going hours past when they had intended to sleep. She told him about the clan wars she had seen as a young woman, the ones that had scarred her people, the peace that had come too late for too many. He told her about the years of learning this land, the mistakes and the small victories. They talked about Dura's future, and this was always the most animated of their conversations because Ugak had enormous and detailed opinions about it, and he discovered that he did too. She should learn to read, Ugak said one evening with a firmness that made him hide his smile, given that Ugak herself had learned only 4 months ago. Absolutely, he said. And to fight. Every orc woman should know how to fight. I have no objection to that. And she should know the clan songs. Ugak was quiet for a moment. Vara would have wanted her to know the clan songs. He reached over and took her hand. She turned her hand over and held his. We will make sure she knows them, he said. They moved through autumn together. The harvest was good, better than any Tobias had had since his father's time, partly because he had an extra set of hands that could do the work of 2 men and did it without complaint. They brought the grain in and stored it and put up the vegetables and cut the wood for winter, and did all the 100 necessary things that kept a frontier homestead alive through the cold months. And when the first frost came and turned the valley white, they were as ready for it as they had ever been. On the first truly cold night, with the fire built high and the wind working at the cabin walls and Dura asleep in her cradle, Ugak looked at the narrow rope bed and then at Tobias and said, with a matter-of-factness that was entirely her own, "That bed is not large enough for me." "No," he said, You have been sleeping in the chair since I arrived." "I have," he said. She was quiet. "That is not," she seemed to be deciding something. "You should sleep in your bed," she said finally. "I am perfectly capable of sleeping on the floor. I have slept on worse." "No," he said. "Tobias, the floor of this cabin is cold in winter," he said, "and you are not sleeping on it. We are both adults and we can sleep in a narrow bed without making a drama of it." He looked at her steadily. "Unless you would prefer otherwise." She looked at him. "I would not prefer otherwise," she said, very quietly. So they learned to sleep together in the narrow bed, which required real logistics, given the difference in their sizes, but they worked it out the way they worked everything out, with patience and small adjustments and a great deal of goodwill. She was warm against him in a way that was entirely overwhelming and entirely wonderful, and he fit against her side in a way that felt, impossibly, like something designed. He fell asleep to the sound of her breathing and woke to the weight of her, and after a month of it he could not imagine sleeping any other way. Winter settled deep over Thornridge, and with it came a specific, enclosed quality of time. The world reduced to the fire-lit cabin, the snow-covered fields, the warm animal smells of the barn, and the three of them moving through it like a family. Because they were a family. He knew it. She knew it. Dura, now 6 months old and expressing opinions about everything with great vocal enthusiasm, seemed to know it too. One January evening, with the snow coming heavy against the windows and Dura asleep and the fire warm, Ugak set down her book and said, "Tell me what you want. Not what you will not push for, what you want." He looked at her. "I want you here," he said, "permanently, not as a guest or a refugee or a temporary arrangement. I want this to be your home, and I want to be—" He stopped, started again. "I want to be yours, and I want you to be mine if that is something you want." "It is," she said simply. "Then I would like to ask you formally," he said, and he was aware of the weight of the words as he said them, the old and frontier-heavy significance of what he was doing. "I would like to ask you to be my wife, Ugak Bloodhorn, and I would like to be your husband, and I would like us to build this life together properly, all three of us." The silence stretched long enough that he felt the beginning of doubt, and then she said, in a voice that was doing several things at once, "You are asking a 7-foot orc woman to marry you on a January night with snow falling on your goat farm." "I am," he said. "Yes." "That is the most absurd and wonderful thing," she said, and her amber eyes were very bright, "that has ever happened to me. Is that a yes?" She crossed the room to him in 2 steps, which was not many steps, and she took his face in both enormous hands and tilted his head back and kissed him with a thoroughness that answered the question completely. The wedding was in April, when the ground was soft enough to be pleasant to stand on, and they held it in the yard of the Thornridge homestead with the mountains behind them and the first spring green visible on the hillsides. The guest list was not large, frontier weddings rarely were, but it contained several of the neighboring homesteaders who had watched the events of the past year and had drawn their own conclusions. Old Margit from the Feddick farm came and brought 3 pies. Cal the writer came and stood in the back looking grown up. The magistrate Reese rode out from Kelford, which Tobias had not expected, and stood at the edge of the gathering with an expression of quiet satisfaction on his old face. The ceremony was a mixing of forms, the frontier words that Tobias had heard at every wedding he could remember, combined with an orc-binding ritual that Ugak had described to him over several evenings, in which 2 people named the things they promised to each other specifically, not in vague terms, but in the particular language of 2 people who actually knew each other. "I promise you steadiness," Tobias said. "I promise to be a place you can come back to. I promise to learn what you need and to try to be that. I promise to protect what is ours and to stand between you and whatever would harm you as long as I am able. I promise to see you, all of you, for the rest of my life." Ugak stood in the spring sunlight above him, her black hair loose around her shoulders, her leather bodice laced precisely, her amber eyes holding a brightness that was entirely his to read. "I promise you honesty," she said. I promise to tell you what is true even when it is difficult. I promise to bring my whole strength to this life and this home. I promise to trust you, which does not come easily to me, but I choose it every day for the rest of my days. And I promise to see you too, fully, as I see you now. There was a sound from the guests, not applause exactly, just a collective exhale, the sound of people who have witnessed something real. Old Margit was crying. She did not seem embarrassed about it. Tobias lifted himself onto his toes and Ugak bent down, and they kissed in the April sunlight with the mountains behind them. And Dura, held by Cal's older sister in the gathering, made a loud and enthusiastic sound of commentary that made everyone laugh. The marriage was, in the practical terms of frontier life, excellent. This sounds a more graceless way to describe it than Tobias intended, but he thought about it in those terms because the love was already established. It had been established since January in that firelit cabin, and what the marriage added was the specific texture of shared life, long and detailed and rich. They divided the work by preference and aptitude, which meant Ugak handled the heavier physical labor of the farm, and Tobias handled the administrative and trading aspects with Kelford. Though as the months went on, and her reading became genuinely fluent, she began taking on more of the paperwork too, partly because she was better at numbers than he was and did not hesitate to say so. Kelford changed slowly. These things always change slowly and never completely, but they change. The magistrate Reese had made it his quiet project to normalize their situation in the town's awareness, not through speeches or proclamations, but through the simple bureaucratic act of treating them as unremarkable when they appeared, and speaking of Tobias's homestead as a going concern like any other. A few merchants who had initially refused to deal with Ugak directly began, gradually, to deal with her directly, because she drove hard and fair bargains, and because Tobias stood beside her and waited patiently, and because eventually most people are more interested in commerce than in prejudice when given enough time. Barath remained hostile for a year and then moved his concern to the southern trading towns, which everyone agreed was an improvement. The Ashfist men never came back. Tobias wrote one letter carefully composed, legally specific, to the territorial court in Redstone, laying out the documentation, and received in return a formal acknowledgement. He filed it with Reese. Dura's status was uncontested. On a Thursday morning in late October, when Dura was 14 months old and had recently taken her first independent steps and had opinions about this achievement that she expressed at volume, Ugak sat down across from Tobias at the breakfast table and said, "I am with child." He looked up from his coffee. "With our child," she said. "Yes." He put the coffee down. He stood up. He walked around the table to her. She was seated and he was standing, and for once they were nearly eye level, and he put his hand on her face and she leaned into it, and he said, "That is the best thing you have ever told me." She caught his hand and pressed it more firmly against her cheek. Her eyes were closed. "I am afraid," she said very quietly. "There are risks with mixed children. I have seen it, not always, but sometimes." "I know," he said. "We will be careful. We will get through it." "Together," she said. "Together," he confirmed. The pregnancy was long and careful, and at times frightening, because the frontier did not provide much in the way of medical reassurance, and there were nights when Ugak's body troubled her in ways that kept them both awake, and nights when Tobias lay beside her in the dark and held her enormous hand in both of his and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was more useful than simply being there. Margit came and stayed for the last month, because Margit had delivered babies on frontier homesteads for 30 years and had seen most of what the body could produce and was not frightened by any of it. She and Ugak developed a friendship that surprised both of them, the tiny, weathered old farmer woman and the vast orc woman, sitting at the table over tea and speaking with total frankness about the body and its discomforts. Tobias learned to make himself useful elsewhere during these conversations. The baby was born in July, on a warm night with all the windows open and the sound of the summer outside. And it was a boy, and he was small and gray-green and perfect and had tusks that were just barely there, just the faintest beginnings of them, and amber-green eyes that were going to take their time deciding what color they were. They named him Varen. Vara's name reworked into something new. When Tobias said it aloud for the first time, holding the baby, who was regarding him with the same supreme skepticism that Dura had brought to him over a year ago, he felt Ugak's hand on his shoulder, heavy and warm. "Vara would have liked you," Ugak said. "There was grief in it, and something that was not grief, something that was on the other side of grief." "I wish I had known her," he said. "She was like me," Ugak said. "But louder." He looked up. "Is that possible?" She pressed her lips together against the smile, unsuccessfully. "Tobias, I am simply trying to understand the physics of it." She laughed fully, and it filled the cabin the way it always had, and Varen blinked in the sudden noise with an expression of extreme personal offense, and Dura came toddling in from the other room with her arms up because she wanted to see, and the cabin was full of all of them, and the summer night was warm and the fire was low, and Tobias thought, "This is it. This is the thing. This is the one." The years that built on that foundation were not simple years. The frontier was not a simple place, and life did not become smooth simply because the central business of love had been settled. There were hard harvests and hard winters and the ongoing, slow negotiation of two people building a shared life across a significant difference in background and culture and physical reality. There were arguments. They were both strong-willed in their different ways, and when they disagreed, they did it fully, with words that had weight. But they had a rule, established early and never broken. No argument was allowed to go to sleep unfinished. They would sit at the table as long as it took, sometimes until 2 in the morning, and they would talk it through until they had found the place where both of them could breathe, and then they would sleep, and in the morning it was done. Dura grew. She was, at 5 years old, already showing the combination of her orc heritage, and what could only be described as pure personal character, a fierce, curious, stubborn child who had no patience for being underestimated and an enormous capacity for love that she distributed selectively and completely. She adored Ugak with a ferocity that was simply biological. She adored Tobias with a slightly more complicated, slightly more deliberate tenderness, the chosen love of someone who did not have to love you but has decided to, which he treasured. Varen was 3, and was already enormous, tracking his mother's scale rather than his father's, and was the most intensely cheerful creature Tobias had ever encountered. He thought everything was wonderful. The goats were wonderful. The snow was wonderful. Rocks were wonderful. He had no particular prejudice against any aspect of existence, and Tobias found this deeply restoring. The town of Kelford continued its slow renegotiation of what it thought about the Chandler homestead and who lived there. It helped that Tobias was genuinely liked. He was fair in his dealings, reliable in his commitments, and had a quality of steadiness that the frontier community valued highly. It helped that Ugak was, once people overcame the initial impact of her, extremely competent and direct in ways that the community found useful. She began, tentatively at first and then with increasing confidence, to offer her knowledge of plants and healing to neighbors who needed it, and this produced a kind of gratitude that is more powerful than abstract tolerance. It helped most of all that Dura and Varen went everywhere with them, and nobody on the frontier, even the most stubborn holder of old prejudices, could look at a 5-year-old with her father's eyes and her mother's bearing asking them seriously about their horses and remain entirely certain that they knew what was natural and what was not. One late afternoon in Dura's 6th year, Tobias was at the fence line, and Ugak came out to him from the cabin, crossing the field in that long striding walk, and she had a piece of paper in her hand that she'd received with the morning's post rider. He straightened and watched her come and thought, as he had thought 1,000 times, that she was extraordinary, the way she moved, the weight and the purpose of her, the sun catching the warm undertones in her green-gray skin, her black hair pinned back, her leather bodice fitted and worn with 7 years of use. "What is it?" he said. She handed him the paper. It was from the territorial court in Redstone. He read it. "They are creating a frontier protection law," she said, "for mixed households. Children of mixed heritage." Her voice was carefully neutral. "The magistrate Reese apparently submitted a formal case. He used our household as the primary example." Tobias read it again more slowly. The law was imprecise and would undoubtedly require years of further clarification, but the substance was there. Frontier territories formally recognizing the rights and protections of mixed heritage families, including children under territorial law. He looked at Ugak. "Reese did this," he said. "Without telling us," she said. "That sounds like him." She was quiet for a moment. "I thought this would not happen," she said. "In my lifetime, I did not think." She stopped. "Ugak," she looked at him. Her amber eyes were bright in the afternoon light. "Come here," he said. She came to him, and he wrapped his arms around her as far as they would go, which was not all the way around her given the physics involved. But she bent down and into him, and he held her as tight as he could manage, and she rested her chin on top of his head, and they stood like that in the field with the mountains behind them and the wind moving through the grass. "It will not fix everything," he said, into the warmth of her. "No," she said. Her voice was unsteady in a way he almost never heard. "But it fixes something. Dura and Varen will grow up in a world with this law in it," he said. Her arms tightened around him. "Yes," she said, "they will." He held on. She held on. The afternoon moved around them, warm and full of the ordinary sounds of the homestead, the goats complaining somewhere in the distance, Dura's voice carrying from the yard with the particular volume she used when she was telling Varen something important, which was always. He pulled back enough to look at her face. He reached up and brushed a strand of black hair back from her forehead, a gesture so automatic that he did not think about it, and she looked down at him with those amber eyes that held, behind the brightness, a depth of feeling that still, 7 years in, made him feel that he was looking at something inexhaustible. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said in the same direct, simple way she said everything that was true. He kissed her there in the field, a long and unhurried kiss in the afternoon sun with the mountains watching, and when they came apart she was laughing softly, and so was he. "Papa," Dura's voice carried across the field with the precision of a thrown stone. "Papa, Varen ate a rock." They both turned toward the yard. "Did he swallow it?" Tobias called back, a pause. "No, he says he was just tasting it." "Then we are fine," Tobias said. Ugak made a sound beside him that started as a sigh and ended as a laugh. "He is exactly like you," she said. "He is nothing like me," Tobias said, starting toward the yard. "I have never tasted a rock in my life." "There is still time," she said, walking beside him, her enormous shoulder warm against his. "I think I will pass on that particular experience," he said. She said. "Coward." They walked back to the house together, and Dura met them at the fence line with Varen on her hip. She was already strong enough at 6 to carry her 3-year-old brother, which said everything about whose genes dominated on the physical side, and Dura looked at them both with the assessing expression of a person who has noticed that the adults have been out in the field for a long time. "Were you kissing?" she said. "We were having a very serious agricultural conversation," Tobias said. Dura looked at him with flat skepticism. She had inherited Ugak's amber eyes and his particular unimpressed expression, and the combination was formidable. "You were kissing," she said. "I could see from the yard." "The view from the yard is not reliable," Tobias said. Ugak picked Dura up. Dura accepted this calmly. She had been being picked up by the most capable arms in 3 valleys her entire life, and they went inside. The cabin was warm and smelled of the stew that Ugak had started that morning, and the late afternoon light came through the windows and lay across the table in long golden bars. Tobias set Varen on the table and looked at him seriously. "Did you eat a rock?" Varen considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "Tasted," he said. "There is an important distinction," Tobias agreed. "And what did it taste like?" Varen thought for a long moment. Cold, he said. Informative, Tobias said. Thank you, do not do it again. Varen looked at the rock he was still holding. He put it in his pocket. Ugak set Dura down and looked at Tobias over the children's heads, and her amber eyes were full of the particular warmth that was his alone, the look that said, "This is the life. This is the full and complicated and entirely right life, and I would not trade it for anything in the world." He smiled back at her. She reached over across the heads of their children and pressed her hand briefly against his cheek. He turned into it, the way he always did. The years continued. The homestead grew. A second structure went up when the children needed more room. A proper outbuilding with a loft that Dura claimed as her domain, with an authority that Tobias could only admire. The farm became known in the district for good grain and reliable goats, and the best preserved vegetables in the valley, some of which were produced using plant knowledge that Ugak had brought from her clan years, and that no human farmer in the area had ever thought to apply to frontier crops. Cal from the Feddick farm grew up and eventually came to work the Chandler land as a hired hand, and he was 17 by the time he arrived and 6'2", and had clearly decided some years ago that the Chandlers were the model of what he wanted his life to look like, which Tobias found touching and slightly embarrassing. Margit died in the hard winter when Dura was 8, and they felt her absence as a specific, shaped loss. The first real loss they had weathered together since Ugak's sister, and they weathered it together the way they did everything, with hands held and words said, and the patient endurance of people who have learned that grief, properly sat with, eventually finds a shape you can carry. The magistrate Reese retired, and his replacement was younger and less certain in his justice. But the laws were written now and harder to undo, and Reese had left detailed records of everything. Ugak began teaching, informally, to anyone in the district who came to her with plant questions or healing needs, and this grew into something larger than either of them had expected. A kind of community resource that had no name but existed nonetheless. People coming to the Chandler homestead with problems and leaving with solutions, and Ugak working through each one with her particular combination of extensive knowledge and frank competence. Tobias watched this happen and loved her more than he had thought possible each time. One evening when both children were in bed and the house was quiet, he sat across from her at the table. She was reviewing notes she had started keeping, a record of plants and their uses, the beginning of something that might become a proper document, and he watched her enormous hand moving a pen across paper with that extraordinary delicacy and thought about everything she had become, everything she had always been, everything they had made together. "What are you looking at?" she said, without looking up. "You," he said. "That is not a useful occupation," she said. "I disagree," he said. "I find it enormously useful. It reminds me of how fortunate I am." She did look up then. Her amber eyes were warm and slightly exasperated, which was one of his very favorite combinations. "Tobias," she said. "I know," he said. "I am embarrassing." "You are not embarrassing," she said. "You are—" She put the pen down. "You are very much the thing that I was afraid to want," she said, "and I am very glad I stopped being afraid." "So am I," he said. She reached across the table and he took her hand, and they sat like that for a while, in the quiet of the cabin that was theirs, with the fire burning down and the children asleep, and the night outside deep and cold and full of stars. The seasons kept turning. Dura, at 12, was already as tall as Tobias and growing steadily toward her mother's scale, and she had developed a fierce interest in law, specifically, in the kind of law that had saved her life before she was old enough to know it needed saving. She had found and read the territorial protection documents. She had found and read every other legal document in the house. She had begun corresponding, with Tobias's help and Reese's old address, with the territorial court directly, asking questions that she expected answered. "She is going to terrify people," Tobias said to Ugak one evening after Dura had gone to bed, having expressed detailed opinions about the inadequacy of the current jurisdiction laws for 3/4 of an hour. "She is going to change things," Ugak said. There was a fierce and quiet pride in her voice that was all her own. Like her grandmother before her, who kept the clan history for 40 years and was not thanked for it. Like her aunt, who walked into a clan lord's territory alone to bring her niece home. A pause. Like her father, who opened his door to a stranger in the cold. Tobias was quiet for a moment. "That was not a difficult decision," he said. "It was the most important decision," she said. "Simple does not mean easy." He thought about that. "No," he said, "it does not." Varen, at 9, had settled into a person of extraordinary physical competence and cheerful practicality. He could do things with a rope or a tool or an animal that astonished people who expected orc blood to express itself only in brute force. He had his father's hands for fine work and his mother's strength, and a personality that was entirely its own. Generous, patient, and deeply funny in a way that crept up on you. There was a morning late autumn, the valley golden with fallen leaves and the air sharp as a slap, when Tobias was at the south field and heard Ugak's voice carry from the yard. He looked up. She was standing in the yard with Varen, who had done something with a length of fence wire that had rebuilt the section that had been down for a week, and Ugak was looking at his work with her hands on her hips and her head tilted. And then she picked Varen up, all 9 years and considerable weight of him, and held him at her eye level, and said something to him that Tobias could not hear. And Varen's face did the thing it always did when his mother was pleased with him, going bright and total. Tobias set down his tool and just watched for a moment. He had opened a barn door on a frozen night because the goats were screaming. He had held a lantern up to the dark. He had seen something that the world wanted him to fear and had made the only decision he was built to make. And all of this, the filled cabin, the children, the woman who was his and whose he was, the law with their household in it, the field going gold in the morning light, all of this had come from that one decision. He picked his tool back up and went back to the fence, and when he reached the end of the day and walked back to the yard, she was there to meet him, as she sometimes was, just standing at the gate with the evening behind her, enormous and still and exactly right. He walked to her. She put her arm around him. He leaned into her side. "Good day," she said. "Very good," he said. "Yours." "Varen fixed the south fence," she said. "I know, I saw. He is your son." "He is your son," she said. "He is our son," he said. She pressed her lips to the top of his head, a gesture so habitual now it was almost unconscious, and he pressed his hand against her side, and they walked inside together, where the fire was built up and supper was waiting, and Dura was already at the table telling Varen something important at volume, and the cabin was full and warm and entirely theirs. He thought, as he so often thought, this is it. This is the whole of it. This is worth every cold night and hard mile and moment of fear. This is the thing. And he was right. On the last morning of the last hard winter of that decade, Tobias Chandler stood at the window of his cabin and watched the sun come up over the Thornridge Mountains, turning the snow from blue to gold in the slow way that always seemed to him like a promise being kept. He had his coffee in hand. He had been standing there for 10 minutes in the quiet before the rest of the house woke, which was his private habit, the 10 minutes of solitude before the full and wonderful noise of the day. He heard her before he saw her, the familiar weight of her step, the particular way the floorboards spoke to Ugak's presence. She came up behind him, and her enormous arms wrapped around him from behind, her chin resting on top of his head, and she held him the way she held things she intended to keep, which was with great care and without apology. They looked at the mountains together. "Dura got another letter from the territorial court," Ugak said. Her voice was rough with early morning and warm with something that had nothing to do with the temperature. "They want her to come to Redstone, to present formally." "She is 12, he said. "She is very much 12, Ugak agreed. "But they asked." "We will discuss it," he said. "We will let her decide," Ugak said. Because that was also who she was, someone who did not make decisions for strong people who could make their own. "We will let her decide," he agreed. The mountains caught the sun. The gold deepened and spread. "I used to think," Ugak said quietly into the top of his head, "that the safest thing was to want nothing, to need nothing, to walk through the world at enough of a distance that it could not cost me anything." "I know," he said. "I was wrong," she said. "The wanting is the point. The needing is the point." "This is the point." He felt her arms tighten. "You are the point." He set his coffee down and turned inside the circle of her arms to face her, tilting his head back. And she was looking down at him with those amber eyes in the morning light. And she was beautiful in the full and total way that she had always been beautiful, and she was his, and he was hers, and there was nothing unresolved between them, nothing left hanging or undone. Every thread had been followed to its proper end. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He kissed her in the winter light, long and slow, with the gold spreading on the snow outside and the mountains holding them in. And from the bedroom they heard Varen's voice saying something cheerful and incomprehensible, and Dura's voice telling him to be quiet, and the day beginning the way all their best days began. Full and warm and entirely, unambiguously theirs.